What's the status of the hypothesis that the war on drugs is the main or a main driver of mass incarceration? And this hypothesis was most importantly popularized by Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. So what's the status of her thesis?
Right. So in terms of simple numbers, the percent of people in U.S. prisons for drugs was around 5% or 5 or 6% in 1980. It peaks at around 20% in 1990. And then since then has declined to around 15% today in the state systems. And so it was never the dominant driver. And it's even more complicated than that for two reasons. One is that it's important to understand what we mean when we call someone as being in prison for drugs. What that means is that is the most serious offense for which they are convicted. It doesn't tell us anything about what they are arrested for or why they went to prison in the first place, right? So you can imagine, we know there's some number of cases, we don't know how many, right? If someone who, say, gets arrested for domestic abuse, he has heroin on him at the time of the arrest, his partner won't testify against him, and so the DAs decide that rather than try to force through a difficult aggravated assault charge with an uncooperative victim, we'll just if you just plead guilty to the heroin, we won't charge you for the aggravated assault, but we're still going to demand prison time for the heroin because of the assault. And so you show up in prison as a low-level nonviolent drug offender, but you're there because of that, either that contemporaneous violence or prior violence on your record that we can't see. And so some fraction of that 15% aren't really there for drugs. We just don't know what that is.
Do you have any sense of where it might be?
None whatsoever. The other thing you realize also is that oftentimes it seems like there's something somewhat very pretextual about the use of drug cases. So if you look at that trend in drugs, that spike in New York State, talk about from 84 to 94 and then starts to decline, that spike in drug cases correlates almost perfectly with the spike in violence that came in the wake of crack markets. And its decline comes basically at the time that violence started to decline, which suggests at some level we were using these drug cases as a way to get at violence. And you might object to doing that, right? Either charge the person with homicide or not. Don't use the crack possession to get the person you might vaguely suspect is guilty of something more serious. But it suggests that the story is still more intimately tied to violence. What's particularly fascinating is over the 1990s and 2000s, as violent crime has gone down, as serious violence has gone down sharply, you'd think that would be the time that we would focus even more on drugs, right? Because there's less violence, so we have more police, less violence, there's more resources to dedicate to these more discretionary offenses. What we see actually is that, at least when it comes to prison populations, the number of people admitted for drugs actually falls. The share of admissions goes down for drugs. It goes up for violence. Violence's share of prison populations grows for both admissions and total population. We actually concentrate even more on violence as violence is going down than we do on drugs.